Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Joining us for the second half of our show is Donald Boudreaux, professor of economics at George Mason University, who blogs under the handle Café Hayek. Don, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Don, I asked you on to give us some insight into what many have called the dismal science. Economics is one of those few fields where two experts can spout diametrically opposed views, yet both can win the Nobel Prize in the same year. Politicians all have their court economists, each of which spend most of the time calling rival politicians' court economists frauds. In a field where it's almost impossible to do controlled experiments, why should anyone take economics seriously?
Because when economics is done correctly, it gives you insight into the real world that no other discipline can give to you. By the way, economists do disagree a lot, but there is a lot of agreement among economists across the political spectrum on a lot of issues, mostly microeconomic issues. That agreement's breaking down a little bit over the past few decades, but there is still a surprising amount of agreement.
No, I remember studying macroeconomics, and when you're doing something like figuring out how to load overhead on a factory floor, it's invaluable. But why do people think they can define GDP, much less measure it to 0.1% accuracy?
Oh, it's foolish. GDP is a constructed figure. I mean, it was designed and reckoned some 80 years ago by people who were trying to figure out how to measure economic activity. I think that the GDP, national income accounting methods are becoming increasingly outdated. They were developed for a world in which the increased economic activity was more or less increased quantity. Now we live in a world, because we're so rich, that more and more our increased economic activity is going toward diversity and more selection and higher quality. Those things are even more difficult to measure than extra quantities. And so I believe that fact, this increased emphasis on quality in our economy, makes GDP even more of a suspect figure as time passes.
Yet so much of economic policy and monetary policy rests on GDP.
Yeah. Well, because it's the stuff that people have. It's what these economists who are my age now, middle-aged economists, and maybe a generation younger than me, they were trained on. They had it in their textbooks. It's what they're familiar with. And so they have a hammer that has been designed to beat that particular nail. So they keep beating that particular nail.
You know, it's not just a hammer, it's a whole toolbox. The Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis churn out benchmark figures that move markets. Many of these are seasonally adjusted, hedonically renormalized, and almost always corrected a quarter or two later. Do you believe any of these numbers?
You know, I don't think they're completely random. Their trends over time might tell us something, but my gosh, they don't tell us anywhere nearly as much as their proponents say they tell us. They certainly don't tell us what the business reporters on CNBC and MSNBC and these other places pretend that they tell us. The economy is not as easy to examine and measure and get a grip on as the simple business reporters seem to think, and as many economists, I'm ashamed to say, seem to think.
Well, we'll come back to the business reporters later, but I'd like to go a little bit further back in time right now. If you look at the long view, human prosperity began a hockey stick improvement a couple hundred years ago. You know, despite ups and downs, that continues to this day. What happened 200 years ago that radically altered the trajectory of 100,000 years of human history?
Well, the first thing that happened is that people started producing a lot more, and they started producing a lot more in the form of innovation. It's not that they just worked harder on the farm or worked harder in their blacksmith shops. They started producing different products. They radically changed the way things were produced. Innovationism sprung forward. What has to be explained is what caused this rapid increase in innovation.
Right.
The economist who I admire most on this issue is Deirdre McCloskey. She argues that it was caused by a change in the way that people, ordinary people, looked at and considered and regarded innovative activity. Before 200, 300 years ago, innovators and entrepreneurs and merchants were looked at with disdain and contempt.
Well, often burned at the stake.
Well, yeah, particularly when they made too much profit. There was particularly when they were especially successful.
Yeah.
Right? McCloskey argues, I think persuasively, that started to change about 200 or 300 years ago, particularly in northwestern Europe, And that attitude, that favorable attitude toward commerce and trade and innovation was taken to North America, where, of course, it flourished in its most famous form in terms of the American economic success over the past 200 or so years.
But the Industrial Revolution was a manifestation of this, not a cause of it.
That's right. It was a result of this change in attitude. And it required other things, too. It required also secure property rights. It required rule of law, required an independent judiciary and all that. And all those preconditions were in place, which was good. But what really sparked it was this improved attitude of ordinary men and women toward market and entrepreneurial activities. And that's what got things going.
Does the Dutch Republic get credit for getting the ball rolling?
Yes. They were the first. Unfortunately, their taxes too quickly grew too high. They started to tax themselves too highly before they could really afford it. And then it's the British who took it to the next level. And when it got to the next level with the British, it kept going up, as it is still today.
Yet the British were mercantilists, right? They had a very peculiar strategy in terms of maximizing their national wealth.
The British were mercantilists during the time of Adam Smith. So Adam Smith's great book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, it was largely a broadside against the mercantilists that Adam Smith quite correctly understood were stalling or keeping lower than it would otherwise be the economic growth of the British people. In large part because of the influence of Adam Smith's writings and also because of other free trade champions in Britain, in 1846, the British started a move toward complete free trade.
Right.
Britain was a free trade nation from the mid-19th century until the very early part of the 20th century. And I have no doubt that freedom of trade, combined with the British acceptance of innovation and British admiration for entrepreneurs and innovators, is what allowed Britain to become one of the wealthiest nations in the world in the 19th century.
Yet you read your Dickens, and it was the best of times and the worst of times. What role does equality play in human prosperity?
Well, it doesn't play a causal role. Equality actually increases as market economies make people richer. It increases in the way that is meant most, that our consumption abilities increase. Ordinary Americans today, I think if you look at the data with any kind of objectivity at all, live better than did John D. Rockefeller 100 years ago.
Yeah.
John D. Rockefeller 100 years ago was the wealthiest American, certainly one of the wealthiest Americans of the 19-teens. We can do things today that John D. Rockefeller couldn't do.
Forget about do things. Our kids don't die because there's no antibiotics back then.
That's right. We can cure illnesses. We can prevent illnesses. We have leisure. We have comforts. We have life expectancies that even the richest Americans back then did not have. And so the focus today with Thomas Piketty and Paul Krugman and people like this is on the amount of dollars or the amount of pounds or euros that people have in their bank accounts.
The scorecard.
Yeah. Ultimately, that's irrelevant. What matters is how much can you consume? And if you look at how much ordinary people could consume 100 years ago compared to how much rich people could consume 100 years ago, and you compare that to today, how much can ordinary people today consume compared to how much can billionaires today consume, and what you will find is a narrowing of that difference. Not only a narrowing of that difference, let me say, but you will find, as I said a moment ago, that ordinary people today on almost any dimension consume more than could billionaires of just 100 years ago. It's an amazing accomplishment.
So what's the difference between a $5 Timex and a $5,000 Rolex?
Well, that's the point. John D. Rockefeller, 100 years ago, could not buy a timepiece that kept time as accurately as a quartz Timex or Swatch watch today, not to mention the kind of time that people keep on their smartphones. A billionaire today can buy, Warren Buffett can buy if he wants, he can buy a gold-encrusted, diamond-encrusted Rolex that costs 5 figures, 6 figures, 7 figures. Ordinary Americans can't afford that, but the time it keeps is the same.
Yet those diamond-encrusted Rolexes make equality advocates crazy.
You know, I'm not saying that there are no differences between the way, say, Warren Buffett lives and the way that you and I live. Of course, there are differences. What I'm saying is that those differences are narrowing and that they are increasingly in matters of greater invisibility. You have to look closely at Warren Buffett's Rolex to see that he's got real diamonds on it and not cubic zirconium diamonds that you might have on your Timex. The ways in which billionaires today are noticeable as billionaires are minuscule compared to the way that billionaires of 100 years ago were noticed. Billionaires of 100 years ago had big limousines. Ordinary people 100 years ago had, if they were lucky, a donkey or a horse.
Yeah.
Today, go buy a Chevrolet. Buy a new Chevrolet. If you didn't know that Chevy meant, modest price car and that Lexus or Mercedes meant expensive car, you couldn't look at those two cars and tell the difference. They're both safe, they're reliable, they don't need tune-ups for 100,000 miles. They're virtually the same. The differences between a new Lexus and a Chevrolet today are minuscule compared to the differences between the transportation of a billionaire of 100 years ago and the transportation of an ordinary American of 100 years ago.
So, Don, let's dig into some contemporary policy arguments through the lens of what you call common sense economics. Fight for 15 is a labor-backed movement pushing for a national $15 an hour minimum wage. Why do people believe that a $15 minimum wage is going to improve the lives of workers who produce less than $15 an hour of value for their employers, rather than see those people replaced by robots?
I can only guess what these people think. My best guess is that they believe, quite naively, that business people have this unbelievable bargaining power or advantage over workers, and that all workers, or certainly the low-skilled workers, are consistently underpaid, and that when government comes in and forces up the wage, businesses just naively go, okay, well, I'll now have to pay the higher wage, and so they'll pay the higher wage. That is such a naive view of the way the world works. By the way, that view assumes that greedy business people really aren't that greedy, because if workers are consistently underpaid throughout the economy, then why aren't these greedy business people out trying to compete away from other employers, these underpaid workers, and thus driving the wages up?
Isn't that what Henry Ford did?
Henry Ford raised, in 1914, I think it was, he doubled the pay of his ordinary assembly line workers to $5 a day. By the way, he didn't do it in order to make his workers buy his Model T Ford. That's the myth. He did it because he was losing workers. That's a hard job. And he would train these workers, and they got sick of it, and after a few weeks or a few months, they would leave. Henry Ford understood that he wanted to keep his workers. So he said, what can I do to keep my workers? What's going to make it more likely that they'll stay employed with me? Oh, I know. I'll double their wage. And so he did it out of self-interest. It was good for the workers. It was good for him. And that is a great example of what employers do in order to compete for workers in a highly competitive economy. Henry Ford wasn't the only employer in Michigan, certainly in America, in 1914. So he knew that if he didn't improve his workers' pay, some other employers would come along and compete them away, which they were doing. So he had to raise his wage in order to match the other bargains that the other employers were offering.
But those $5 a day workers, once they were trained up, were obviously delivering more than $5 a day of value. Otherwise, he would have gone bust. How's that supposed to work for a cashier at McDonald's?
The way economists say it is it's jargoning. But the way economists say it is that workers are paid the marginal productivity. Employers hire workers up to the point where hiring an additional worker at that wage no longer pays. So the last cashier hired at McDonald's contributes just a little bit more to McDonald's bottom line than it costs McDonald's to hire that cashier. If you raise the wage, arbitrarily raise the wage of that cashier with, say, a minimum wage statute, you're going to price that worker out of a job. That's what happens. When I look at the literature on the minimum wage, and there's a lot of it, and it's been pouring forth now for decades. When I look at the literature on the minimum wage, it tells me just what economic theory predicts. If you make it more costly for employers to hire workers, employers will hire fewer workers. I have a great example of this. Just yesterday, I had never seen this before, although I know it's been around for a while. I was driving to work, and I was behind a garbage truck. And usually when I see a residential garbage truck, I expect to see, men behind that truck picking up garbage. And
oh, no, they're robot arms now.
I saw the robot arms. And so the lesson is that almost all tasks can be done in multiple different ways. They can be done with labor. They can be done with machines. And when you raise the cost to employers of using workers, you increase the attractiveness to employers of getting rid of those workers and substituting machines in their place. And that's what happens. I have no doubt about it. The empirical literature tells me that that is the case, and basic economic reasoning and common sense tells you it's the case.
Moving up for minimum wage workers, President Obama recently used his pen to change the rules on overtime pay. Some have hailed this as a great benefit to workers, others as a disaster waiting to happen. Remind us what that's all about.
So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is also the act that creates the minimum wage, there's a requirement that workers who work more than 40 hours a week have to be paid at least time and a half for each hour. There's an exception to it. Salaried workers who have managerial responsibilities and who make over some minimum annual salary. And what Obama has done is raise that minimum threshold. So now workers who make just under 48,000 as opposed to 23,000 or 24,000, workers who make just under 48,000, now all of them, they work over 40 hours a week, they have to get paid overtime. What this does in effect is raise the cost to employers of hiring workers on these contracts, on salaried contracts. We're already seeing, given that the Department of Labor has announced the implementation of these policies, they go into effect December 1st. We were already seeing employers say, well, I'm going to switch a lot of my employees from salary to hourly and then keep better track of their hours. And we were already seeing some employees complain about this. It's a value to many employees to be salaried. You get more flexibility. Many employees are quite willing to work, this week 50, next week 30, but under the new rules, that makes it more costly for employers to hire and employ workers on those terms. And so what it's going to do, it's going to reduce the welfare of most of these workers. It's going to reduce their flexibility on the job, and it's not going to do anything to raise their total annual pay, despite all the happy talk that the administration gives in favor of these regulations.
How are we going to measure that? I mean, most economic policies enacted by politicians are judged by their intentions and not their results. We don't judge plumbers that way, but how are we going to go back and find out whether this change in overtime pay really did hurt the people that it was supposed to help?
All measurement's a little bit difficult when you're talking about the economy, but this actually is fairly easy to do, and we have studies. Other countries have done this. We have similar kinds of regulations that have been put in place at the state or local level, and I've read a number of these studies. And one of the things that we see when these kinds of overtime pay regulations kick in, one of the dominant ways that employers and employees react is that the worker's base salary is reduced. The employer says, okay, I'm going to reduce your base salary from $40,000 to $35,000. The employee makes it up in the higher overtime pay, but in the end result, and this is the best outcome for the employee, by the way, the end result is that the total pay isn't changed. It's that it's calculated differently rather than it be all in a salary. Some of it now is in a salary and some of it is in mandated overtime pay. We have studies on what happens, and put simply, the studies show that employers and employees simply do not react to the regulations as the government thinks they'll react. They adjust in ways that go far to nullify the effects of the regulations. Unfortunately, a lot of those adjustments make things worse for the workers who are intended to be helped.
Looking more widely, both presumptive presidential candidates seem to be out on the stump bashing free trade. What makes protectionist policies so popular?
Because people can only see the present and they only see what's going on today. The advantage of free trade is that it makes us richer tomorrow. It has benefits today. I mean, you can get better deals when you can buy freely.
As a consumer, sure.
Yeah. But the real kicker, the real benefit of free trade comes in by encouraging domestic producers to switch from relatively inefficient industries into more efficient industries. And that takes a little bit of time. And they're only encouraged to do that under the competition from foreign producers, competition that is intensified by freedom to trade. And so people see what's going on today. They see the jobs that are lost today to free trade. And so they panic and they say, oh, yeah, this is terrible. We shouldn't have free trade. Look, protectionism has always been the default mode of those who don't know economics. And politicians, needing the votes of these people, pander to it. I have no idea if Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, I have no idea if they really don't understand economics or if they're just pretending to. But it makes no difference because when they get into office, either of them, they will, I assume, pursue the protectionist policies that they advocate on the stump. And what these policies will do is reduce competition in the American economy. That might save some jobs today, but it will make us poorer over the long run because it will prevent our economy from competitively adjusting to new economic realities. And the longer that those adjustments are prevented or slowed, the poorer we become. We are rich today in large part because we've had not total, complete free trade, but we've had trade. We've had open trade. The current candidates want to, if not completely prevent that, they want to dramatically slow it down. I haven't heard this kind of protectionist gobbledygook. Well, I've never heard this kind of protectionist gobbledygook from major party candidates in my lifetime. You have to go back to the late 1920s, 1930s to hear this. And you heard it last from Herbert Hoover.
But protectionist policies get a lot of cheerleading from the press. A few years ago, you wrote a book titled Hypocrites and Halfwits. What accounts for the extraordinary level of economic illiteracy among journalists?
Wow, that's a really good question. I don't know. The simple answer is, well, they haven't taken as many economics classes as they should have. But look, journalists are interested in telling morality tales. That's what sells. Readers want to hear morality tales, good guys, bad guys. Economics is largely not about good guys and bad guys. It's about unintended consequences. It's about effects that are not seen rather than just the effects that are seen. If you're a journalist, you want to talk about what's immediately visible. In fact, if you have a photographer with you, the photographer can take a picture of the factory line that has shut down. It's very difficult for that photographer to take a picture of the many new jobs scattered all over the country that have been created as a result of free trade.
Or even worse, the invention that's never invented.
Or the invention that's never invented, the new medicine that never comes into being, the new lives that are never saved because of this new medicine that has never come into being. These things are very difficult. They're impossible to photograph, and they're very difficult to write about because they're not facts in the same way that Joe Jones just lost his job at the John Deere factory because American farmers are now buying more farm equipment from a Chinese farm equipment producer. Those are facts that can be reported, and those are facts that people apparently eat up as readers. Oh, this is terrible. If only we buy more farm equipment from Americans, we'd all be richer. It's not true, but it does seem true to people who do not understand economics.
Well, Don, it seems like you've picked up the torch from Bastiat and his famous seen and unseen allegory. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That was Donald Boudreaux, professor of economics at George Mason University, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at realclearmarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. We'd like to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.